Please remember that the complete information for the class that you are about to view is at elithecomputerguy.com. Not only do we have our videos there, but we have part lists, diagrams, pictures, and even complete code examples. So if you are watching this video and you want more information, please go to elithecomputerguy.com. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli, the computer guy, and in today's class, we're going to do a brief introduction to IDEs, or integrated development environments. Basically, these are software applications that you use in order to code whatever programming projects you are trying to develop. So if you watch many of my coding classes, you will see that many times I simply use a generic text editor in order to write code. So Notepad, TextEdit on the Mac world, gedit in the Linux world, so on and so forth. So if you're trying to write PHP, Python, if you're trying to write code in many programming languages, the fact of the matter is you can simply use a basic ASCII text editor in order to do that. The problem is, though, is just like with anything else you try to use a text editor for, you don't really get a lot of functions and features out of a text editor. You don't get the programming equivalent of spell check. You don't get the programming equivalent of grammar check. You don't get the ability to simulate your programs or do anything like that. So just like you could write a term paper using a normal text editor, you probably don't want to. You want to use something like Word in order to write a term paper. The reason is because you'll get all the functions and features that you're used to in a full-fledged word processor. Well, just like you can write code in a text editor, you probably don't want to because you want all the functions and features you will get in a full-fledged IDE, or integrated development environment. Basically, when we're talking about IDEs, we're talking about software packages such as something called NetBeans or Visual Studio from Microsoft. And with these packages, you get many functions and features that you would not get out of a basic text editor. So we'll be talking about IDEs today and give you a little bit of the thought process that will be required for picking the IDE that you plan to use. Now stop, hold on. I know the first question you're going to ask. I know the first question all noobs want to ask is they're sitting there and they're looking at how long this video is and they're saying, Eli doesn't need to spend 10, 20, 30 minutes talking about all this different stuff about IDEs. He just needs to tell me the best IDE. Eli, tell me the best programming language, the best framework, and the best IDE. If only Eli did those types of videos, then he'd be so successful. But he just sits here and talks for, half an hour or hours on end about all these things to think about. People don't want to think. They just want to know what the best product is. Well, the important thing to be thinking about when you're looking at choosing an IDE is choosing an IDE is very much like choosing a video editor. So I've now been creating online education for, can you believe it, 10 and a half years. I have literally now been doing this over a decade, legitimately, right? And the thing is when I sit down and I create these videos, once I get the video files, I can use any number of editors and encoders to create the finished output, right? So I'm talking to the camera, I will take this file, and for me, I will use something called Final Cut Pro. So I use Final Cut Pro for a number of reasons. I purchased it a long time ago for only $250. I never have to pay upgrade fees. It works with Mac. I personally like Mac. It's very easy to use, right? There's all of these reasons that I use Final Cut Pro. But you'll hear a lot of people out there, oh no, don't use Final Cut Pro. You should use Adobe Premiere. Well, there's a lot of good things to say about Adobe Premiere. Well, but then there's also iMovie, and there's also Sony Vegas, and there's also variations of editors and encoders on Linux. And the important thing to understand is all these different pieces of software allow you to edit and then encode videos. They just do it their own way for their own price points. They have their own features, functions, plugins, so on and so forth. And so you choose what video editor you want to use based off of a number of different criteria. The same is true when you're looking for an IDE. Again, I'm going to show you a number of different IDEs today, just give you a bit of an overview. And at the end of the day, which one you pick will depend on many different factors. And so that's an important thing to be thinking about with an IDE. Don't think about the perfect one. Look at your particular situation and then decide based off of your situation which one works for you. And realize that there will be a learning curve with these IDEs. So IDEs are full-fledged software packages, just like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro or anything else, right? There's a specific way that you use them. There's a specific workflow. There's a specific way to do keyboard shortcuts and that type of thing. And so something to be thinking about is once you pick whatever IDE that you're planning to use, then you'll be able to dig in and get to learn it better and make it easier and faster for you to be able to code with. So that's one of the things is don't think about the perfect IDE. Look at your situation and decide what IDE will work best for you. So the first thing to be thinking about when you're thinking about which IDE to use is basically what are your requirements, right? So different IDEs have been created in order for you to code for different programming languages. Some IDEs, such as NetBeans or Visual Studio, allow you to code for numerous different programming languages, whether it's Python or PHP or Java or JavaScript or C#. Many of these IDEs have multiple languages that they're able to interact with. On the other hand, there are IDEs that are language specific. So if you look at Python, there are a numerous number of IDEs that are specific to Python. If you're looking to create for iOS, there's something called Xcode. So Xcode is specifically for iOS. If you're looking to develop for the Android platform, there's an Android IDE out there. So one of the first things that you need to be thinking about is what are your requirements? Beyond the simple requirements of what language do these IDEs support, the next thing that you have to look at is price. I'm going to show you NetBeans. NetBeans is free and open source and you can just go use it. Visual Studio, there's one version of Visual Studio that's free, but there's another version of Visual Studio that is $6,000. Again, it depends on what business you're in. If you're in a multi-billion-dollar business and they're throwing money around, spending $6,000 for a license, literally, it may not matter. It may not matter to your organization or you. On the other hand, if you're some startup, out of your basement, maybe you need to keep all the money possible. So that's one of the things to be thinking about with price. Price is a very significant thing with any product that you're going to purchase. Again, remember something called total cost of ownership, where it's the idea of when you purchase an item, you don't just budget for the initial purchase of the item, but then you budget for the ongoing cost. Again, with Visual Studio, not only do you have to pay an upfront fee, but then there's a yearly upgrade fee that may become prohibitively expensive for you. So that's one thing to be thinking about. Then one of the final things to be thinking about when you're thinking about the requirements for what IDE you're going to use is go out to tech events, talk to your friends in the coding world, and find out, frankly, what IDEs do they use. Right? When you use an IDE, again, IDEs are specific pieces of software. They have their own ways for doing things. They have their own plugins that work for them, so on and so forth. Well, one of the things that you find is weird in the technology world is that certain products really people catch on to them in certain regions differently. I talk about this. So way back in the day, back 20 years ago when I got into IT, very weirdly, it was one of these things where on the East Coast, everybody was NT 4.0. So if you were creating your domains in the Windows world, you're using NT 4.0. On the other hand, if you went West Coast, it was all Novell NetWare. A product called Novell NetWare is gone now. There wasn't a lot of rhyme to reason. It was just east of the Mississippi, Windows NT. West of the Mississippi, Novell. That's just how it was. So if you're going to get certified in order to become a system administrator, if you're west of the Mississippi, you better get certified in Novell. And if you're east of the Mississippi, you get certified in NT. I think about it the same way when startups were really big back in like 2012, 2013. I talked with a lot of coders around the country, and it was very curious. On the East Coast, PHP was big. PHP was one of the big back-end languages. On the West Coast, again, west of the Mississippi, Ruby on Rails was the big back-end language. Why? Again, don't get me wrong. There's arguments pro and con for both of those languages. But it was weird that the country was literally segmented east of the Mississippi, they're doing PHP predominantly. West of the Mississippi, they're doing Ruby on Rails predominantly. And so an important thing to be thinking about is go to tech events in your area, talk with other technology professionals in your area, coders in your area, and frankly, just ask them what IDEs that they're using. What you may find is in your area, for some reason, people have decided on a particular IDE or maybe a particular couple of IDEs, and so it will make it easier for you to get a job if you know that particular IDE. Again, it's like any other type of software. If you have experience with that type of software, it's easier to get a job and it's easier to get up to speed once you have the job. And so if you're sitting there and you've got 4 different IDEs to choose from, frankly, going with what everybody else uses may be the easiest way to go. So that is something to think about. Again, with NetBeans and Visual Studio and so many of these other IDEs, go and talk with folks and see what they're using. The same is true with that whole concept of think about what your department is using if you're going to be using an IDE. So again, looking at your organization and seeing what IDEs other people in the company are using, that can be a useful thing, again, to streamline and get everybody on the same page. With IDEs, one of the powerful components of IDEs is something called collaboration. So again, collaboration software, it's in every product nowadays, but the ability for multiple people to be working on the same project at the same time. If everybody is using the same IDE software, it'll be a lot easier to do collaboration than if one person's using NetBeans and one person's using Visual Studio, one person's using PyCharm, something like that. So these are some of the things to be thinking about when you're going to go choose your IDE that you may not at first blush have considered. So when you're looking at these IDEs, there's going to be many different functions and features that these IDEs will offer. And again, different IDEs will offer different, features and functions. One of the first things that you have to think about is what programming language you plan to develop for, and then look for IDEs that are able to support that particular language and see how much of that language they can support. Again, some IDEs will allow you to basically code in the language and not really do a whole hell of a lot else. Where other IDEs will give you a much more full platform to make your development a lot easier. So one thing is to look at the programming language the IDE support. The next thing to be looking at is things such as the plugins the IDE supports. So just like with a lot of different types of software out there, IDEs allow you to add plugins that other people have written. Again, one of the important things to realize in the coding world, a lot of people get into coding and they kind of think like everything is invented brand new every day. Every day, I'm going to invent something brand new. That's not how coding works. There's a lot of copy and paste in coding. A lot of copy and paste in coding, right? It makes life easier. If one person has created something, they can just put it up on GitHub or whatever else, and then, a million other people do not have to rewrite the exact same code. And so one of the things is true with IDEs, where you're able to write plugins for these IDEs, not IEDs, IDEs, to allow you to complete certain tasks. So things basically like syntax checking, doing other things. And so one of the things you should be thinking about with the IDEs is not just the IDE itself, but what plugins are available for the IDE that may make your coding experience easier. And this is also one thing to realize, that if you switch IDEs, right, one of the problems if you switch is that the new IDE that you go for may not have the same plugins or equivalent plugins that you're used to. And this can be a bit of a learning curve if you go to a new IDE and realize all of a sudden something that you have taken for granted because it was offered to you in a plugin in the past is no longer available to you, or maybe a little bit more difficult than you realize. Now, when you go to actually write code, there are a lot of easy, valuable things that these IDEs allow for. One of the first things that they allow for, it sounds simple, it sounds stupidly simple, but it makes life so much easier, is be able to collapse snippets of code. So if you just simply write out code in a normal text editor, right, you write out 1,000 lines of code, well, then if you have to go through and audit that code or modify the code, you actually have to scroll through 1,000 lines of code. One of the simplest things in these IDEs is the ability to collapse functions and to collapse if-else statements. So basically what you can do is you can go through the code, and basically it's based off of brackets, and there'll be little plus and negative signs, plus and minus signs by code. And basically what happens is if you hit the minus sign, it'll shrink, it'll collapse the code into the first line. So if you have a function, let's say you created some custom function, it'll just have the custom function, and then it'll have a little plus sign by it. If you want to see what's in that custom function, you hit the plus button, and it will expand out that function so you can take a look at what's in there. When you're done modifying it or taking a look at it, you get the minus, and it'll shrink. So all of a sudden, instead of having to surf through, get through 1,000 lines of code, now everything's compacted down. You can go, okay, so this is calling this function. Let me expand this function and see what this function is doing. Okay, this is what this function is doing. And then you can make your modifications and shrink things down. So it's simple things like that that can make IDEs really, really useful for you. Beyond that, there's basically syntax and more or less spell checker within these IDEs. So when you're typing something out, things such as if you forget a bracket. If you forget a bracket, it will remind you. It'll give you some kind of error code to say, hey, you forgot a bracket. Not during the debug process, not after you wrote, but when you type something out, you're supposed to put a bracket, you're supposed to put a delimiter, you're supposed to put something like that. You forget, you're going on to the next whatever function, the next if-else statement. It'll give you a little warning to say, hey, you forgot that. One of the other nice things that many of these IDEs have is the autocomplete function, especially when you're writing a lot of code. You're going to have different functions that you've created, different classes, different variables, that type of thing. You can forget exactly how to type or the specific name of something that you previously created. And so one of the nice things with the autocomplete is as you start typing out, let's say a variable, it will then give you possible variable names that you have already placed into the code. So you're going to type out something, and again, you forget, is it plural? Is it singular? Is it $student or $students? Right? If you get that wrong, you screw everything up. Well, you go to type it out, and it gives you the autocomplete, and you can see it's students, right? So autocomplete is something that's very valuable. Beyond that, there are what are called debugging tools. So what debugging tools is basically you normally click on this little play button thing, and the debugger will run through your code and look for errors. Most of the time, when it finds an error, it will then highlight the entire line of code, and then you can try to figure out what mistake you made there. Again, especially when you're doing functions or other things, you're trying to pass a variable around. Again, you misspell it, you do something stupid. Basically, you hit that debugging tool, and it'll go through and it will try to find errors to make life easier for you before you actually try to deploy this to the real world. Beyond that, beyond the debugging tool, many of these IDEs will also give you the ability to actually run the code, possibly in something like a simulator. So if you're using Xcode is for the iOS world or Android's development studio, they will have a little simulator. So after you've debugged the code, after you've verified it should do what it's supposed to do, instead of having to actually upload the code to a device, to a computer, server, whatever else, you can actually just run it in a simulator locally, again, to verify that when you push buttons or when you do things, you think it does what it's supposed to do. And so you can go and you can do quality assurance through the simulator, verify at least in the simulator it does what it's supposed to do, and then you can upload it to your server, upload it to your device, and from there continue to do the testing. So the simulators can be a very valuable thing. It can save you a lot of time because instead of having to upload to a server, instead of having to upload to a device, you can literally just start running the code in the simulator, see where there's problems, modify the code, run it in the simulator again, so on and so forth. Beyond that, most of the time, these IDEs will give you the ability to basically upload or publish your code. So that may be as simple as just being able to FTP upload to a server, or again, in the Android or the iOS world, it may have a process to actually allow you to publish to their store. And this is just another component that's all built into the IDE to allow you to go from coding to doing to the debugging, to the simulations, to when everything seems to work how it's supposed to, actually uploading it so that it can be used on a device or a server. And the final thing that you should be looking at your IDEs, depending on what your environment is the collaboration ability. So again, in the modern world, when you're thinking about programming, you may be on a large team, and that team may be part of a larger department, right? So you may be having a lot of people working on the software, helping develop the software. A couple of people are dealing with one module, a couple of people are dealing with the front end, back end, so on and so forth. And so having collaboration tools that are built into the IDE can be very valuable because that keeps everybody more or less on the same page. Again, if you've ever had employees, having one employee, having two employees, it's pretty easy to keep track of what folks are doing. Having 5 employees, having 20 employees writing code without a way to keep track of everybody. Oh, yeah. that can make your life miserable really quick. So these are some of the overall features you should be thinking about with IDEs, and that's one of the reasons, or some of the reasons, why IDEs are a hell of a lot more valuable to use than something just like an ASCII text editor. So now that I've talked a little bit about why you should be looking at using an IDE for your software development, let's go over to the computer and I can show you a number of examples of these different IDEs just to kind of give you an idea of what you should be looking for. So I've pulled up a number of different IDEs here to take a look at on my computer. So the first one, as I was talking about before, is this IDE called NetBeans. So NetBeans allows you to develop for Java, JavaScript, HTML5, PHP, C, C++, and more. One of the valuable things for NetBeans is that it's free and open source. Especially a lot of students, especially a lot of people that don't have very much money, they like to use NetBeans because you get a full-fledged IDE with a lot of functionality, and you don't have to pay anything for it, and it's open source, so you won't run into any weird problems with it in the future, where you can run into problems with some of the proprietary IDEs that are out there. As you can see, you can go through, they have different plugins here, so they give you the option to add functionality that's not built into the core NetBeans IDE, and so this is something to look at. Again, one of the things to be thinking about is that with these IDEs, one of the questions is what platforms can you run the IDE on? So again, for me, what's very important is that an IDE is cross-platform. So basically you can run it on multiple different operating systems. So again, with NetBeans, you can run it on Windows, you can run it on Mac, you can run it on Linux. Again, this is important in the coding world now because many times companies literally do not care what operating system that you use. So I have talked with many companies now that basically when they hire employees, once the employee is hired, the employee is simply asked what operating system they want, and depending on what they say, they are given a computer. So if they say Windows, they get a Windows system. If they say Mac, they get a MacBook Pro. If they say Linux, they get a PC with Linux on it. And so it's very important to understand is that for many development shops, they literally do not care about the operating system. They just want to give the coder whatever operating system works best for them. And so having an IDE that can work on any of the operating systems that may be used, again, makes it easier in the development world because then at least everybody's using the same software and they have the same features and functionality. You don't have to worry about the Windows people using one IDE and the Mac people using a different IDE and the Linux people using a different IDE. So this is something to be thinking about, that cross-platform support. Past that, we can go over and take a look at Visual Studio. So Visual Studio is Microsoft's IDE, been around for a really long time at this point. If we go down, we can see they have a number of different options here. They have the community, the professional, the enterprise. This gives you a lot of different functionality. But one of the things is the price. Now, a lot of people, again, you think about something like an IDE, and you don't really think about it being that expensive, but it gets expensive. Monthly subscription for professional is $45 a month. For a standard subscription, it's $1,200 for the first year and then $800 a year in renewal fee. So that can get expensive quick, especially if you have a development team of 10 or 20 people. You can see here that you then have different features, different functionality based off of what you pay for. If you think that's expensive, because I know right now, there's a couple of new people out there that are like, oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, that's not ridiculous. This is ridiculous. So they have the enterprise version. Enterprise monthly subscription is $250 per month, $3,000 a year, or the standard subscription is $6,000 for the first year, and basically $2,500 for renewal. So again, this can be a very important thing with picking your IDE and it really depends on like what kind of company you're in. If you're in a company that's rolling in money, if you're in a company that's dealing with the Microsoft stack, then honestly, it's paying $6,000 for this license. They may not think twice about it. On the other hand, if you're trying to develop something out of your dorm room, $250 a month gets to be a little expensive. What we'll probably be using going forward for a lot of our coding classes that we're going to be doing. Again, I'm looking at this from my personal requirements and the requirements for trying to teach people how to do more sophisticated coding is what we're probably going to be using is this product called Visual Studio Code. So this isn't a full-fledged IDE. So Visual Studio is a full-featured IDE, blah, blah, blah. Visual Studio Code basically gives you a lot of the IDE functionality that you need. And so what I like about it, especially with trying to teach people, is it gives you a rather full-fledged IDE environment. Plus it's free, so Visual Studio Code is free. And again, in my world, for trying to teach you folks, one of the things that I like is that it's cross-platform. So they have a Windows version, a Mac version, and a Linux version. So I can use this and show you folks how to develop more complicated code. And it's something that it's free, so you're not going to have to worry about paying for. It's something that's cross-platform, so whatever operating system you're using, you will be looking at the same IDE interface that I'm using. And one of the things I like about it too is basically since this is a subset, this is basically just a smaller version of Visual Studio. If I show you Visual Studio Code, when you go out to actually get a job, if your company is using Visual Studio, then you'll be able to use the same skill set that I taught you using Visual Studio Code to go over and use Visual Studio. So those are the types of things that you need to be thinking about. Again, the important thing with an IDE is think about your particular situation. When I'm dealing with students who frankly have no money, I have no idea what OS they're using, and I'm trying to give them skills that'll actually get them a job, right? Those are requirements that I have to think about. For you, it may not matter, right? So those are some things to ponder. We go over and take a look. So Android Studio, again, if you're going to be developing for the Android world, this kind of just gives you a screenshot of what this looks like. So you have a preview pane over here. So this previews what your app's going to look like. Here's the actual code itself. Here's your folder structure. Here's some other things that are going on. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what the Android IDE would look like. Again, a fast emulator. Install and run your apps faster than with a physical device and simulate different configurations and features. So that's one of the nice things too. Again, especially if you're doing like mobile development, or if you're developing for software that's going to end up being on Raspberry Pis or something like that, actually being able to run the software on a desktop or a laptop CPU and resources, basically it'll mean that everything is more responsive. It'll be a lot faster for you, and so it'll be easier to navigate through and make sure everything does at least what it's supposed to do. And then once it does, you can shove it onto the actual mobile device itself, and then see how it works in the real world. So being able to do things like emulate, but actually have all of those laptop or desktop resources can be very valuable. Go through here, you can see a lot of different options I have for Android Studio. Again, Xcode, as I talked about before. So Xcode is Apple's IDE. So if you're going to be developing for iPhone or Apple Watch or iPad, so on and so forth. Again, it's the same kind of thing that you kind of saw with the Android Studio. You have the code, you have your folder structure, you have a simulator, a preview over here, so on and so forth. So that would be the iOS world. And then just to show you, again, for language specific IDEs. So let's say you're in an environment, all you're doing is Python. So you're doing Python, your entire department's only doing Python, so you don't want to worry about Visual Studio or anything else. Then there are IDEs for specific languages. PyCharm, the professional IDE for professional, or the Python IDE for professional developers. You can go through here and you can see it's been designed specifically for Python. Again, depending on your environment, that may be valuable for you. And then you can go down to the really lightweight things. I never thought of Notepad++ as an IDE. I still don't think of it as an IDE, but I don't know, maybe. I was doing like a search for different IDEs just so I could show you folks things. And Notepad++ literally came up as an IDE. When I used to do coding videos, I used to use Notepad++. Don't get me wrong, I like Notepad++, but just to understand how lightweight I guess an IDE can be. Basically, Notepad++ is just a small, very lightweight way that you can write code. It gives you the code lines. It gives you the ability to expand and collapse code snippets. It gives you the ability to upload FTP. It gives you some other options. Again, I wouldn't really think of it as an IDE, but if you're making you're creating small PHP scripts or something like that, again, using something as basic and as Notepad++ might be all you need. So again, these are the different options for you. You got NetBeans, it's free. You got Visual Studio, there's sort of a free version of it, then a $6,000 version of it. Again, Android, Xcode, PyCharm, and all the way down to Notepad++. All of these are viable, solid, good products. Which one you will choose depends on your particular situation. So there you go. Now you know a little bit about how to pick an IDE. Again, there is just a crap ton of different IDEs out there. What you decide to go with depends on your situation. Again, what language you're going to use, what tools that you need to use, what IDEs people in your particular area are using, what is your budget, do you need collaborations, so on and so forth. So it's one of those where, again, you just got to sit down and think about which one of these IDEs you're going to use day in, day out. Again, since I'm talking to you in a video, I will say it's much like how content creators have to pick a video editor, whether you use Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere or iMovie or Sony Vegas or whatever else, right? All of those pieces of editing software, more or less, you get the same output. You get a video file at the end of it. But how you create the video file, how you do the editing within the software, what plugins that are available for you, what is the cost, what do companies actually use? So if you're using this particular product and then you want to get a job later, do the skills that you've gained by using whatever your home setup is, will they translate when you go to work in the business enterprise? These are all the types of things that you need to be thinking about. So again, one of the important things, as I've talked a lot about when you're going to get into coding, is you need to go to tech events, you need to go to meetups, you need to talk with people, and you need to see what they are doing. Basically, just sit down, start talking with people, say, hey, what do you do? Out of curiosity, I'm new to this, I'm looking at all these IDEs. What IDE do you use? Oh, does everybody else in your company use that IDE? No, really, they use something else. Oh, why do they use that other thing? You sit down, you talk with 5, 10, 20 people, you do that, you'll get a very good idea of what IDEs people in your area are using, and then you can make a better decision on which one you will pick. Again, at the end of the day, to be clear, you are not married to an IDE. You can move over to a different IDE for whatever reason, but it's like anything else. You're going to get muscle memory. You're going to get used to using an IDE, and the more you're used to using an IDE, the faster it'll be for you to create code, right? The less time you have to spend doing Google searches to figure out how to do a function or feature, and the more time you can spend actually writing something and deploying that into the real world. So these are some things to consider. Again, for us, we're going to be using that Visual Studio Code, basically because even though it's very lightweight as far as an IDE is concerned, it is free, it's multi-platform. And again, it gives you the basic skills that'll be required when you go over and actually want to upgrade over to the Enterprise Edition. So those are some things that you need to be thinking about. As always, I enjoy doing this video, and I look forward to seeing the next one. If you like the content that I create, please think about going to EliTheComputerGuy.com and becoming a member or donating. Please understand that all of the educational videos are in front of the paywall. That includes the videos, that includes the notes, the diagrams, and the code example. All of that is freely available and in front of the paywall. But if you want to watch opinion videos or if you want to be able to comment, you do need to become a member. Membership is $5 a month or $60 a year and gives you access to those opinion videos and the ability to comment. If you don't want to become a member, you just want to give a one-time donation, there's also a donate button where you can do that. Please understand, in order to provide the education that I am, it does cost money. Servers cost money, equipment costs money, travel costs money. All of these things cost a reasonable amount of money, and the fact of the matter is YouTube's advertising program no longer supports creators the way that it used to. So if you want these classes to continue to stick around and you find them to be valuable, please think about either becoming a monthly member or donating a few dollars for this project.